Anna, welcome.
Thank you, Paulina. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited to talk about my favorite subject, and I believe yours, which is education. Um, I want to start with the question, what was the most formative event in your childhood that you believe has shaped who you are today?
Yeah, so growing up, I had a very atypical sort of childhood. I was born in Panama, but because of my dad's job, we had to move around a lot. So I lived in 7 different countries, and in these countries, I had to go to many schools. So we moved from Panama to Colombia when I was like 10 months old. Then we moved to Venezuela, then to
Wow.
India, then Mexico, then Brazil, then back to Panama, and then I did college in the US. So by the time I was almost 15, I had been to 10 different schools. And
Wow.
the way that this sort of worked is like what ended up happening was that when I would sometimes move halfway through the year, or I would have to start, in the year at a different time when I would move to the different countries, or I would move to a country where I didn't speak the language yet. So I would be placed at a lower grade. And as you can imagine, I was a bit academically behind, and this can really affect a kid's perspective on their confidence levels and how they are as a learner. So my parents were very aware of this, and I was a very social kid and very adaptable. I sort of had to, right? I was the new girl 10 different times. And they would always try to emphasize the things that I was doing outside of school, so that I could feel good about myself, and so that I realized that I was very good at other things, even though I was a bit academically behind because of all the moving. So, for example, when I was 8 years old, we moved to India. And I didn't speak English then yet. So you can imagine it was really difficult to make friends. And I was, again, very social. So they realized that at the time I was very interested in dance. So they said, well, maybe she can't communicate yet, but if we put her in dance class, she doesn't need to communicate. This is another form of expression, and she can make friends this way. So they would always try to do these things so that I wouldn't really feel the impact of moving so much. But when I reflect on like my learning and my schooling experience, and sort of like the learning that happened in school and how much of that has stuck through the years, I realized that it's very, very little. Like I have a good memory for very specific things and moments that were meaningful to me, but I don't remember the things that I was learning. I didn't really remember the teachers in many of these countries, which is sort of crazy, because kids usually have a connection with their mentors and their teachers. And what I realized was that in my attempt to sort of navigate this flawed system in all these different countries, I would pick up on the things that would make me appear as if I were learning. Right? What we call I learned to play the game of school. Many kids learn to play this game. I was very good at it, right? So I picked up on the things that I had to do to be a successful student. I knew I had to raise my hand every now and then in every class so that I would get my points for, participation. I knew that I was better off not questioning the teacher just because I would get in trouble. I picked up that really quickly. I was very curious and I had so many questions, but that were left for home for mom and dad. I picked up on, I had to try to fit in, even though I was very different. I would always try to do the things that everyone was doing and sort of explore the ideas that the teacher was interested in. I was trying to always please my teachers. And this was sort of like a pattern that I did to sort of like survive, right?
Yeah.
But this is not a good thing, right? This is sort of like an imitation of learning. So kids who go through 12 years of schooling trying to cut corners and get around with things just because they want to get the formal learning out of the way so they can focus on the things they really enjoy doing, what often ends up happening is that after 12 plus years of schooling, they don't really know what they're good at or what drives them or what kind of things they want to spend the rest of their lives doing. Do they feel passionate about? What skills do they have that are different from other people? We don't really get a chance to explore these things because we go for so many years just sort of in autopilot. And this can be very dangerous. And many parents don't quite pick up on this because it looks like the kids are learning, right? Because they've mastered the art of playing the game of school. I was very lucky to have parents who really valued and understood that, learning is not strictly limited to school. And they really valued the learning that happened outside of school.
Right.
So my mom specifically, she would stay at home and take care of us when we would come back from school. My sister and I have a younger sister. She was what I call like the perfect enabler, right? So she would really like try to pick up on the things that my sister and I were very interested in at the moment and passionate about. And it didn't really matter what it was. She just wanted for us to dig into it, and she would really support and feed those interests. And they would change so often. And I remember vividly my mom just being super supportive, and whatever it is we were interested in, she would find a class or she would find a group of other kids that were interested in the same thing. And she was always really trying to make sure that we had a productive interest and we were working hard on that. And so I grew up believing not only that my ideas mattered, regardless of what they were, but she inspired me to believe that I could use those ideas to really change things and to do something bigger than whatever we were learning in school. And she emphasized so much this idea of learning, but learning about the things that we were interested in and things that really mattered. So she cultivated that desire for me to learn, right? And because I was inspired to continue learning, I've been able to do all these things that I do now, right? It's because I've been so obsessive and so passionate, and I work really hard and devoted a lot of time to the things that I was interested in. And really this, if you ask me, it's really what it takes to accomplish something incredible, right? So a lot of this is something I didn't pick up in school, but something that I picked up from my parents, and really what made me want to become an educator, and it was sort of like that springboard for me to want to change things. And that's really what made me an effective educator. Now that I realize it's really not what I learned in ed school or what I learned by observing great teachers in their practice. It was really just trying to model what my mom did with us and trying to be that inspiration and that enabler for my students. Now, we can talk about this later, but it became really challenging to do within a school system, like the school setting. So that's why I ended up leaving. But that's really what really shaped me in my childhood years.
That's such a good answer to that question. I love asking that question because everybody has something, but like I genuinely cannot imagine going to 10 different schools. Like for me, and I've told you this before, but moving from Bulgaria to the United States was one move, but it was so traumatizing for me. And for me, that's my answer. Like if you ask me that question, I would say that move. Because I think as a kid, not speaking the language, not knowing the cultural norms, not having friends, it can kind of completely change your personality in a way. Like I went from super extroverted in Bulgaria to super introverted here because I didn't want the attention. Like you said, like I figured out how to fit in. I loved conforming. I was like, just don't pay attention to me. But that eventually becomes like internally you feel one way and externally you're another way. When you moved so many times, was there a particular environment that you actually had a really hard time adapting to, and why?
Yeah, I would say my move to India, and again, it was the other countries that I had been prior to that. We spoke Spanish everywhere, and I was used to. I'm very extroverted, very social, and I loved talking. Like to me, that was just I loved having conversations since I was little. I have all these videos of me talking when I didn't even have the size to talk, but I was talking. So moving to a country where suddenly I couldn't communicate. I didn't know how to make friends. I was really frustrated. It was really challenging. I was only 8 years old, but I remember feeling like it took forever before I learned English. And that's why I so vividly remember. And I thank my parents for doing what they did of putting me in dance class, because that's sort of what helped me overcome this idea of like, oh, I can make friends. There are other ways of doing it. But really not speaking the language to me was very, very challenging. And then once I mastered English, then the other countries that we moved to, I was able to, go to school and talk to everyone because we mostly spoke English, but that was really challenging.
Okay. So, and I think I know why that was so challenging for you, because you probably couldn't express yourself in the way you wanted to. And as a kid, that's really hard. Did you have as much energy as a child that you do today? And how did that go for you in the traditional school system?
Right. This is funny because, again, I had good grades because I figured out, what to do to get good grades, not because I was necessarily learning. But I always had complaints from teachers saying, she can't stay still, like the typical very hyperactive kid. She can't stop talking. Like, we don't know where to sit her anymore because she will talk anyway. And it's funny because when we moved from my childhood home, my mom and I were looking through all this like notes and things from school. And there's so many notes from teachers saying that, like, she just can't. And it's interesting because then when I became a teacher, I had like, that's how kids are. It's not like I was particularly different. Like, yeah, there's some kids that are more passive and more quiet, but the typical kid has lots of energy, wants to move around. So this idea of having us sit down for hours staring at a teacher, like that's not how that's not how I think. Like I need to be in movement in order to think. I need to be talking. I need to be engaged. And this is true for many kids. So it was really challenging. I remember that I think when I was 13, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and they told my parents that I had to start taking medication, like all the things that now when I look back, I'm like, oh my gosh, I was just trying to be a kid, right? But it was very helpful so that when I became a teacher, one of the things that made me really effective too was that because I retained that element of the childlike, and I was able to put myself in the shoes and say, well, what worked for me when I was a kid? What didn't work for me? Then that made me be a lot more flexible with my students and, I and connect with them, because again, I can identify with the way that they're feeling. They're angsty. They want to move around. They don't want to be sitting around. So yeah, it was definitely challenging.
I think about this a lot because I still remember I was in 7th grade when I first found out that a lot of my friends were actually taking medication to pay attention in school. Some of them legitimately had these problems, but others were like, I just need to focus, so I'm going to take this. I was like, what? But it is interesting that the natural reaction to a kid that has tons of energy is like, let's dull that down. Let's like calm that down instead of encouraging it. Because I also understand, like as a teacher, you got 30 kids. Like, how are you supposed to entertain all of them at the same time? So my question to you is like, what do you think is the role of a teacher currently in today's school system?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and they're different, like it varies, right? So traditionally, the role of the teacher, as you know, has been to sort of be the fountain of wisdom and make sure that there's order at all times, and that the kids are following instructions, and that they're, absorbing all the curriculum and the material, and that they're passing the test. Like really, that was the role of the teacher. Obviously, with time and as we have more research and people started to realize that's not how kids learn. And that's really harming the way that kids are absorbing the information, right? And we can talk about that in a bit later, but it's been slowly changing to, I've worked in many different schools and I studied education. So they do teach you that the role of the teacher has changed, and that you're more, it should be more student centered, and the teachers are more of a facilitator and enabler, but this is still not true. Like, even though the theory is there, and in practice, you don't really see that in schools, and it's not the teacher's fault. The teachers, especially within the system, they have to follow a very rigid curriculum. They have to cover a lot of material, and for many teachers, their salaries are tied to student scores and performance. Right. So of course, that totally shifts your priorities, even though most teachers worth their salt know that, how kids learn and the things that they should be doing, they can't really do that because their salary is on the line. So that's part of the reason why I decided to leave, just because I got really frustrated, that I wasn't spending kids' time in meaningful ways, and that I knew the things that would make them tick and that, would make them want to keep learning and do things that were incredible, but I really couldn't do them. I really couldn't do them within the system. So when I left, I started to explore more the alternative education space and the, progressive education. And if you look at schools like Montessori schools or Reggio Emilia schools or Waldorf schools, these are more progressive educational approaches, then that's when you start seeing that the role of the facilitator has changed. The facilitators are really there to sort of pose questions and help kids, take those questions in whichever direction they want. And they feel like, the learner is really empowered, and they sort of follow the lead of the kid, right? It's a very flexible approach. And they're sort of there like my mom was, right? Like an enabler. They try to get you to inspire you, and they sell this idea of learning, and they make you want to continue learning, provide the tools and the space to sort of make that happen. And that's the ideal scenario, but we see that more with younger crowds. As students get older, then, it tends to become more rigid, and then they start to lose ownership over their learning. And then you start to see the teachers sort of like step up and be more, more teacher focused and teacher centered. So it really depends on the kind of school that we're looking at.
Can you give us a little bit of background why school is structured in the way that it is? Like, why do we have these classrooms with this many people and you have to sit at a desk and pay attention and it's lecture style? Like, why is it like that?
Yeah, so 200 years ago, like in the 18th century, we needed lots of manufacture work, right? And we needed kids to be working at factories. So they had to come up with like a way to train, and it was really based off military training as well. So they wanted to train kids for the military and train kids to work at factories. That's sort of like what our economy needed at the moment. And so they came up, it was actually in Prussia in the 18th century that they came up with this idea of having like classroom settings with lots of kids in there, and they had like a squadron leader actually at the time. And that was sort of like the teacher, and the whole thing was like imposing obedience, making sure that everyone was learning the same thing because they were all going to be doing the same things in the factory, in the factory work and as military. So it was really down that path, and the best teachers were those that really imposed obedience and compliance and that, told kids what to do. So of course, the years went by and you see how all our other industries started to change and adapt to the needs of our world nowadays, except for education. So nowadays, and of course, we've talked about this before, like we need wild and crazy innovative thinking, right? A lot of the jobs that we have nowadays require you to think differently and be creative and not do things like everyone else has done it, because then you're not going to be solving any new problems, right? Which is going to keep doing the same thing. But schools are not focused on this at all. Like they're not worried about producing creatives or innovators, or no, they're just worried about, doing things the same way, having kids memorize information, following a curriculum that they're so outdated. Like I remember looking at the lessons that I had to teach, and I was so frustrated because I was like, when are they going to use this? Never. Like I've never used this information, and whenever I need it, I can just Google it. Yep. So again, 8 hours a day with kids, like 7 to 8 hours a day. And we're doing things and preparing them for jobs that no longer exist, and in ways that are there's like a mismatch between the way that we do learning in school and the way that we know that humans learn. So we know like humans are hardwired to learn through play, through self-exploration, by doing, by being physically active, by teaching others, by engaging on the things that you're interested in, when you see the relevance of what you're learning and how it applies to the real world. And, in schools, we don't do that. It's as if we don't pay attention to that. We pay attention to, we need to learn from a curriculum. Kids have to pass this test. And then what? Like if you ask kids about the material after a test, most of them don't remember. And this doesn't concern. Like schools are very concerned with what kids are learning and not whether kids are learning at all or their attitudes toward learning, which is really what I am, really focused on. And I think it's super important.
Ana, as you were talking, I was actually thinking about my own high school. I went to a public high school, but this mismatch that you're talking about, it's not even across different schools. It can happen within one school. For example, I went to a public magnet school and I was in like the science magnet at the time, but because I wasn't good at math, I had on level, like regular level math classes. Then I had honors classes in some situations. And then I also had Associated Press. I was about to say Associated Press. AP stands for Advanced Placement classes, right? So I think I took advanced placement like literature, and then I had on-level math, and then I had honors like social studies. But what I noticed within the structure of the actual school was when I went to my on-level math class, the teacher was very concerned about, are you on time? Are you silent during class? Are you following the rules? Did you do your homework? When I went to my AP and honors classes, there was so much more autonomy and freedom and trust in me to do the right thing. Like I remember one time in my AP class, I was like, hey, I need to go like interview somebody for my paper that I'm writing. And they were during class and they were like, sure, go ahead. And that level of trust only came in those classes. And I didn't see it in the on-level classes. And I think if you're a kid who got stuck in on-level and you go through your entire education like that, you're being trained to be on time, to follow directions, to listen to your boss. You're not taught to think independently. Do you see that?
Absolutely. The way that I think about it is like we've taken learning out of context by placing it in this institutional framework that focuses on things like grades, on obedience, on compliance, instead of the things that really matter, which is like the joy of learning and your curiosities and exploring and thinking independently. Like we've just decided to focus on the wrong things because we have the wrong incentives in place, right? And so what ends up happening is that school lacks purpose. The kids don't really know why they're there. Like if you ask them, why are you here? They'll tell you, because I have to. Like, what do you mean? Like, this is not an option.
They don't see a different option.
They don't see a different option. And then if you ask them, why are you learning? And this is across the board. Like, it doesn't matter what age, they will tell you, I am learning because I need to pass a test. And I'm like, okay, but why else? Because I need to go to my next grade level. Okay, but why else? Because I need to graduate from school. Like they never go into because this is what's gonna, help me after school, because this is what's gonna lead me to have a richer life and closer to what it is that I wanna do, how I can add value to the world. Like they don't see that. And that's really concerning. And I think that there are a lot of people thinking about this now and trying to, explore a different path. But there are also lots of people that just never stop to think about these things. And that's why a lot of my work is raising and posing questions, because I want for people to just stop for a second and realize how a lot of what we do in schools doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And at least being aware of this, parents can support their kids at home and do the things like, for example, my parents did, which was really emphasize the learning that was happening outside of school, considering that inside school, this is the situation, right? So that's definitely very interesting.
I want to ask you, so you became a teacher and you were teaching kids like 8 to 9-year-olds for a while. Could you tell that early on what this kid was passionate and interested in?
Absolutely. So I always say that I love that I got to work with third graders. That's like my favorite age, because kids they're still not too cool for school. So they still want to learn. They're very curious. Like that's sort of like that last year where you see them still being kids, right? And kids are naturally very excited to learn, and they're curious and they want to dig in. They ask tons of questions. So if you are the perfect enabler, then they're sort of able to preserve that. But then what I started to notice was that as my students moved on to different grades, suddenly their interest in school would begin to fade. And that's because, again, they're very excited to learn, but suddenly learning is imposed, right? So they don't really have a choice over the subjects that they're learning or the way that they're learning. And it just starts to lose purpose, like we talked about in, a few minutes ago. And that's partly because our system is so rigid and because we have all these structures in place that remove the things that really matter, right? And it's so interesting because if you look at countries like Finland, for example, they have this mindset that less is more. So they've removed a lot so they have fewer classes, they have fewer time in school, like less homework, less testing. So there's less of everything, less content that's covered in a year. In the US and in other countries in Latin America as well, we have the opposite idea. We think that the more we do, the more we add, then the better, right? So we want, more testing and more time in school and more homework and a more rigid curriculum and all these things. And really what that's doing is, we're cramming kids with all these things. They have no downtime to sort of like reflect on what they're learning or time to engage in things where they're learning independently and exploring the things that they're interested in, right? So the whole thing to me, I don't know how we could create a system that's more wrongly thought at this point, right? It just really blows my mind.
But what were the specific things you would notice in the kids where you're like, oh, you're like really interested in science? And like, I can kind of tell you're going down that path. Like, what were you paying attention to as a teacher?
Yeah. So I, especially those first years, I deviated a lot from the curriculum. So I would see the things that we had to teach, but then I would sort of open it up to the students, because I learned this when I was observing a teacher in one of my student teacher placements. She would always, she would read the objective, but then open it up to the kids and be like, how would you want to learn about this? Like what makes sense, right? And they all have different interests. So they would always sort of find a way to connect what they were, if one kid was interested in dinosaurs at the time, the other one was super interested in fantasy books. They would find ways to connect And that's something that adults and curriculum designers have such a hard time doing. And then when you open it up to the kids, they're like, boom, they're able to connect the things the content that we had to learn to what they were interested in and make those connections and say, why don't we do it this way? So what we did was we had like a student of the week. And then that student got to really share the things that they were passionate about and their interest at the moment and whatever, and then pick how we were going to address specific topics in the week, according to that kid. So that was really interesting. Of course, halfway through the year, I sort of had to stop this because then it started time for test prep, and that's like a whole world. So we really had to like deviate from, but those were the moments where the kids would come back 2 weeks after and they would still remember what they had learned. And that's the only time that I would see that in school. Like regardless, even if I try to make lessons super engaging and super fun, at the end of the test, like the reality is that the kids wouldn't remember. And sometimes I wouldn't remember what I taught. But when you structure it differently and you sort of open it up to the kids and you let them choose how they want to do it and how they would explore a specific topic, then that's a whole different story. Like that's when learning sticks.
Absolutely. I learned this a long time ago. So when people look at me doing the profile, if you objectively look at my life and the patterns of how I learn, you'd be like, of course she's doing the profile because that's how she learns. In my whole life, history classes, really hard for me. I just have a very hard time remembering dates, remembering events, like putting it in context of other things. But there was one point I remember I had this world history class, and again, I was having a hard time. When the test came, I was like, I cannot remember. But then I realized that I learned so much better if I pick a person during that period of time. So for example, French Revolution, you can tell me all the facts about the French Revolution, I will not remember. But the second you're like, Marie Antoinette threw these lavish parties and all the regular people hated her. And then she got, the guillotine, she got executed. It was just like, whoa, because I realized that when I form an emotional connection with a person, it triggers my memory and I'm able to remember it through the lens of that person. So like, that's cool. Like maybe a teacher here and there noticed that I liked people-focused learning, but is that even a problem that's fixable? Because how do you do that in a classroom of so many?
Well, but many things came to mind when I was listening to you. That's fascinating, Polina. What a great example. So, a big problem here is that in school, we segregate topics by subjects, right? So it's sort of like they're isolated. And that's a really difficult way to make connections and make learning stick, right? So for example, if you were about to learn about the French Revolution, then yeah, you wanted to mix it with writing. You wanted to mix it with reading about someone who's done, but it's like you want to pull from different areas and from different fields in order to form your opinion about whatever it is that you're learning. Yeah. In school, it doesn't work like that. So in school, it's like we're doing math right now and we're doing strictly math. Like this is how it works. And this is the way, this is the process. And this is changing a little bit. Now we're starting to open it up a little bit more and being like, this is what we're teaching kids. You can figure out how you want to get to the solution. That's not that common, but it's happening. But if you notice, like I remember this was so incredible. Like the first time I posted a math problem, I think it was an addition. It was a subtraction problem. And I was like, I hadn't taught how to do subtraction. I was like, figure it out. I want to see if you were able to do this. So we're subtracting this from this. And one of the kids started by doing it from the left. And I was like, well, I don't know how he's going to get to the answer. And he was able to figure it out. And then he stood up and explained it to the whole class, how he was starting it from the other side. And the kids were able to understand. And they were like, oh, that makes so much sense. Completely different from the process that we had in the curriculum and in the book. So what I'm trying to say is like, the way every kid learns differently. So if we're able, even if you have a classroom of 30 students, like if we stopped focusing on the process and the way, like, or having the right answer in math is different because you do need to have the right answer. But if we just say, okay, so let me see your thinking. I want to see how you get to this answer. And if you don't get to the right answer, we'll figure it again. But I want to see your thought process behind it. You'll realize that a lot of kids are so smart, way smarter than we give them credit for. And they're able to figure out it in their own way. Many teachers are not open to different ways of doing things because again, they're so fixed on this is the right way to do it. But if we're more flexible and we forget about things that don't matter, like trying to measure things and trying to, then this kind of opportunities happen. You can have a Polina who you figure out that she learns by reading a profile, right? So I guess if we, I don't really, we've resulted to a lot of nonsense with this idea of like accountability and measuring and testing and comparing and this and that. If we're able to sort of like forget about that and find more genuine ways to measure and see a kid's progress through their learning journey, then we would open up spaces for this kind of things, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder how much space teachers, are going to have in the next few years, considering, COVID and everything that's happened, to be more flexible with these approaches, right?
Absolutely. So that leads me to, you have this wonderful newsletter and you recently wrote, we must teach our kids to think differently, yet schools do exactly the opposite. So what is happening in schools today and how can we actually help kids develop independent thought?
Right. So what happens is that, again, because we're following a curriculum and because we're starting lessons already knowing the answers, we're not leaving space for kids to actually come up with their own ideas. So what you do in school is you basically study the ideas of other people and you do things that have already been done before. And there's little space for you to deviate and sort of like go down a rabbit hole or take your own path and do things differently. In fact, those are considered the troublemakers, right? Those that decide to question things, even if they don't do it.
Yeah.
And many kids actually don't know how to question things appropriately because we haven't taught them. So of course, when I talk about like having kids, question the defaults and sort of like cultivate this attitude of skepticism, parents are like, if I do that, they don't know how to do it. Like they'll come across as rude. I'm like, of course, because we haven't guided them through this process. And, being contrarian in school is considered something negative when if you think about it, that's just the kids like, kind of like natural way of saying, wait, let me think for myself for a moment. Give me a break. Like, yes, that's what you think. And that's what you're telling me. But now let me stop and think, does this make sense? Let me see if I can, do some research and back some of these ideas or find a different idea. Let me change my mind. But there's no space for this. So we don't go through this process. And that's actually the process that makes you being an independent thinker and come up with, new ideas and original ideas, right? That there's no space for that in school. And it's very frustrating because a lot of, again, the kinds of creative works that kids want to do, like kids nowadays admire like the YouTubers and the content creators and the people who sort of like did their own thing and came out on top, the original thinkers. And I cannot even, maybe they don't have the words to express this, but it must be very frustrating being in school, knowing that that's where you're heading, that's the kind of job you want to do or the kind of thing that excites you, and not be able to do it in school, a place where you spend so many hours a day. So, yeah.
I think about that a lot, mainly because I think, like you, I was a pretty perfect student according to the teachers, just because I had figured out the game, right? Like I knew, show up on time, do your homework, pass the test, like don't question teachers, even if I vehemently disagreed. And I, on the one hand, was a pretty perfect student. I graduated from college. And then there was Anthony, my husband, who was a nightmare of a student when he was in school. Yet he became successful in entrepreneurship. I had a different mentality coming out of school where I kind of thought I had these like rigid mental models where I was like, okay, get a job, do a good job, please your boss, move up in the company. I never even thought I could have my own business. Like I just always thought I had to be accountable to somebody. Somebody always had to be telling me what to do. So how do you distinguish between challenging authority and thinking for yourself, or and whether it's like a discipline problem with a kid?
So what you'll notice is that the kids who have this behavior issues in school are this is in my experience, from what I've noticed, are the most creative kids, and the kids who actually have, I'm like, oh my gosh, this kid has so much potential to create something really cool, very passionate. But because those are not the kids that fit in the system, they are so frustrated because they're so creative and they have these ideas and they can't execute them in school. And whenever they try to do what for them is worthwhile, they get in trouble. So imagine how frustrating this must be for a kid. So whenever I see a kid, and this is something that I learned, obviously challenging when you have 30 students, but something that I learned, whenever a kid is acting out or whenever you have these contrarians, and again, very difficult for a teacher to be like, oh, he's saying like, well, why? Or why are you asking this? It's very difficult for a teacher to keep her cool or his cool and be like, let me explain it to you. The reaction is usually like, why are you questioning me? Like, how dare you? Like, no. But what I try to do, like I tried my best to remain cool and remember that that this kid is very creative and there's a mismatch here. So just try to, keep it. So I would really get along with those troublemakers because I would take the time to sit down and talk to them and try to hear out, well, what it is that you're trying to tell me. And I would try to find ways. Like I remember I had kids, you would walk in my room and you would have kids standing up sometimes and working standing up. You had kids that were on the floor in the rug, working from the rug. You had kids who have like bouncy balls and different things that maybe for somebody visiting, they would be like, well, what's going on? What a mess. Like, what's this? But really, I was just trying to do the things that would make them think better or that worked for them, because that's how you enable them to come up with these ideas and to do the things that are going to make learning stick for them. So it wasn't easy, but I learned to see that those troublemakers and the ones that are trying to be defiant really don't have the way to express themselves, and just help them find that language and that appropriate way of questioning things. And actually, let me share one quick story because I just remembered. I remember that I had at the beginning, I would put out, which I stopped doing because I realized that this was not the kind of rewards that I wanted to use, but I would give out stickers and I would put positive message like, you did such a great job. And I had this student who hadn't done a great job, but I knew that she had a learning disability. So I wrote a little message saying, you did great, and trying to like highlight the things that she did well. Yeah. And then I had this other student who was incredibly gifted and he sort of lacked this like social skills, and he was very contrarian. He was that kid that other teachers could not even listen to because he would question everything. And sometimes he didn't know how to do it, right? But I understood where he was coming from. And I remember he came up to me and he's like, why did you put a sticker and you wrote very good job and all those comments? Because I read her piece and it was not good at all. Like I'm so confused. I'm so confused why you would say that. And it made me realize like he obviously didn't know that this girl had a learning disability and what I was, but I, another teacher would have probably be like, how dare you say that? Like you can't, but I understood what he meant. He was confused. Like it wasn't a great piece, but yet it had its sticker and it said, great job. You did this really well. So those mixed messages are really difficult for kids who are the troublemakers and who have this, right? So, I mean, it's a matter of trying to put yourself in their shoes and understanding where they're coming from. And not every kid fits in the system, like you were explaining earlier, right?
Okay, so there's so many things to talk to you about, but one thing I want to ask you about is discipline. So, like I told you, I was a pretty perfect student for my whole life, but there was one incident. I think I've told you my detention story, but it was the first week of 9th grade and it was this new high school. And it was a like government 101 class, some sort of social studies class, but it was very clear. Kids are smart. If the teacher is teaching this out of love for teaching, or if they're just like the football coach and they were put there to teach. So this was the latter situation. And I was sitting next to my friend and we were about to take a quiz. And she turned to me and was like, what's the date? And I told her the date and he immediately looks at us and he was like, detention, no talking during the quiz. And I was like, she asked me, he did not care for my explanation. I was like, whatever. So I walked up because I had to put my mom's name down and the number so he could call her to tell her I got detention. And in a moment of defiance, I knew I already got detention. So I wrote down the number, I turned around and then I turned back around. I was like, by the way, you spelled government wrong on the board. And he was like, double detention. And so to me, it was so funny because I knew I was a good kid. Getting detention 2 days in a row did not label me as a troublemaker. People were shocked that I got detention, but I can see very easily how somebody else who got that is like, oh my God, like now I'm labeled a troublemaker, and they adopt that label. What do you think about discipline and detention, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, expulsion, those things? What do they do to a kid?
Well, first of all, they don't work. Like they don't work. And it's crazy because if you think about it, the teacher and the adult ends up doing double the work because they're using the wrong tactics. So kids especially have a hard time connecting their behavior to the consequence if the consequence is not, what's the word that I usually use? It has to be a practical consequence. Like it needs to make sense. And if you wait to give the consequence, like for example, you did something wrong now, you're going to get detention later in a few hours. The kid fails to make that connection. And the whole point of a consequence is for the kid to learn and not do it again. But if the kid is not making that connection with the consequence, then it's a complete waste of time. And what it does is it causes this attitude of rebellion. And you get this distaste for authority or for your teacher or whatever it is that you're doing. So a way better approach approach when, we're bound to make mistakes. The first thing is that I would always give my kids the benefit of the doubt. And when a kid feels like the student trusts them, so like, for example, when they would go to the bathroom, the rules of the bathroom, like teachers don't trust you to go. I would be like, I trust you until you give me a reason not to. So if I let you go, I'll always let you go to the bathroom. But if by any chance I go out and I catch you that you're, doing something, then I'm not going to trust you anymore. And we remove that privilege. But I would always start by trusting them, because that makes them respect you more. They feel understood, and it makes them not want to do things that would get them in trouble, because they're starting to form that bond with you. Then with a natural consequence, for example, if one of the rules is you can't run down the stairs when we're walking down because you can fall and you can trip, and a kid runs down, there's always that kid that runs down the stairs. Teachers usually say, okay, you know what? No recess for you, or 5 minutes off recess. Recess is 30 minutes from now, and it has nothing to do with what you just did. Like, the consequence is not related by any way to running down the stairs. Instead, something you can do is, okay, now you're going to go all the way up again, and you're going to try walking down, but this time the right way. So that's a natural consequence, and the kid can connect. And then you always stop and explain why. It's not because I said so, or because it's one of the rules in the school, but because if you run, you can trip and you can fall and hurt yourself. So always explaining to kids the why. And this is not only for behavior, this is also for what they're learning, and for anything. You always need to take time, even if it's obvious for you, to explain the purpose and the reason for your requests, or what you're teaching, or what you're proposing or imposing in school. Yeah. But then also make sure that the consequence is right away, and that it's directly related to what the kids did. And always give kids the benefit of the doubt. Like, if you want for them not to misbehave, you need to win them over by, trust, and just for them to see that, like you said, they're there because they care and not because they have to do things. Like, the teachers that are the most strict are the ones that are the least respected, and they're the least effective, right? For most kids, like, they don't even pay attention to that person. So it's tricky because it's sort of counterintuitive, but it works. And I've seen how it works.
Yeah. My last question around this topic of independent thought is, one of my favorite books is Educated by Tara Westover. And in it, she talks about how, the first time she set foot in a classroom was in college. And she says, because of where she grew up and because of who her dad was, growing up, she knew nothing else but to adopt the beliefs of her dad, which made her hold racist, sexist, and homophobic beliefs that weren't really her own, but she didn't know anything else. But to Tara, the classroom was a safe space where she could express those views out loud, and people would challenge them in a respectful way. And she'd be like, oh, wait a second, and then change her beliefs, which then would change her identity. And she would see why those were wrong. My question, though, is now, how safe is it to express those kinds of views in a classroom where, like, literally it could end up on social media and then you're labeled a certain type of person for the rest of your life?
0. It is not safe at all. It's not. And this is something that, teachers are aware of this, schools are aware of this. Like, I remember we had professional developments where we would talk about these things. Like, it's not a safe space to talk about things. But also because parents play a big role here. Mm-hmm. So I was the kind of teacher that I liked to help, hold these conversations, but then I would encounter many times emails after school where parents were like, why are you even talking about these things? Like, these are just 9-year-olds. And I'm like, well, because they had a question and they were asking me. Right. And if I am a trusted educator, if I don't give them a good answer, they're going to go and look it up on YouTube or ask a kid in the bus that may give them the wrong answer. So, there's this, it's so crazy because what Tara talks about there, like, I haven't experienced that in any school. In school, we need to be so careful about the things that we say, the things that we let the kids talk about, because there's all this like taboo topics that we can't touch upon. And a lot of it comes from the culture of parents, right? And what they feel like kids should know or shouldn't know. But I always say that, information is power. Like, you're better off. Like, kids nowadays with the internet and with, all this, they can figure things out so easily. What they need is an adult role model or someone they can trust that are going to answer their questions, that are going to say, you know what, I don't know that answer, but let's look it up, that are going to listen to them. And like you said, debate with them their ideas, and not like just shut them up or being like, we're not going to talk about that. But it's like, you're curious about this. Let's talk about it. I may not have all the answers. These are challenging topics, but let's look for some books that can help us with this. But like, sort of like engage in this quest of wanting to know these things with them, right? The way that it's approached in school, it's like, no, this is like, we're not going to, almost as if it weren't our problem. And then what happens is that
So
they're
weird.
going home, and many parents are like, well, schools should be handling this, but there's clearly a miscommunication. So this is not really being handled anywhere, right? Yeah.
And the second you make something taboo or shut it down, of course it's going to make the kid want to like express it more or figure out why it's taboo. I'm all about like, let's lay it all out there, talk about it, figure out why you believe that. But if you're not allowed to express that, like that gets scary.
And if you're not allowed to ask, so I often think about this, like if you're not allowed to ask questions as a kid, when
Right.
you're trying to make sense of the world and understand right and wrong and form your opinions and then when are you going to get to ask these questions? Because like as an adult, like your views are already formed and you're
held to a different accountability standard.
And if you haven't formed your own opinions and your own way of independent thinking, then you're just going to end up doing what's been done for so many years. You're not thinking for yourself, right? So to me, we have it so backwards. Like the schools should be a place where we let kids ask tons of questions and let kids fail often and not make a big deal about it. Be like, okay, let's try again. Those two things aren't happening. We're punishing kids for asking questions and we're punishing them with grades that go on permanent records every time they fail. So if they're not having opportunities to do these things as a kid, then when are they going to have that chance, right?
Absolutely. And I think I was lucky that those things were talked about at home. So at least I had an outlet where it was safe and I could express that. But I can see how it must be so scary when everybody has a phone now and like suddenly you're on YouTube saying some crazy stuff. Okay, so you're no longer a teacher. You now work at a company called Synthesis. Can you tell me about it?
Yeah, so it's been very exciting. So when I left about a year and a half ago, I was searching for learning experiences that would teach the things that I thought that really mattered, right? So we already talked about this, like not the things that are preparing kids for jobs that don't exist, but really like how to think independently and how to solve real problems and ethical problems in new ways and how to, challenge kids creatively and how to sort of like listen to their ideas and help them execute them, teach them how to work in teams with, other kids and understand that you don't always have to be a leader. Like sometimes you play a different role and it's a very important role. So learning them not to learning subjects, but to see the big picture and how to like synthesize from different topics. So all these things is really what I had in mind. I was like, that's what's exciting. That's what's valuable nowadays. And that's what gets kids engaged. Yeah. So I started looking and I tried a few things with one of my friends, David Prell. But then we sort of like encountered some challenges in scaling. And then by writing online, the founders of Synthesis contacted me and they said, hey, look, this is what we're doing. We're still stealth mode, but would you help us launch and sort of like share to the world what we're doing? And this was after I observed one of their beta testing sessions and I was completely obsessed and blown away. I shared with you one of the videos before I made it public of the kids.
Incredible.
When, Paulina, have you seen kids
Never.
talk like that about a learning experience?
These kids were way more eloquent than I am, but it also shows you just how intelligent they are and how much we underestimate kids.
Exactly. And before I go into what is Synthesis, one of the things that because it's something so different and a completely new way of thinking about learning and about, teaching kids, it was hard to find the words to describe what it is. And then when we asked the kids, I was like, well, why don't we ask our students? They were just so eloquent and knew exactly how and what they were learning. And they were so excited about it because we put them front and center of the learning experience. So what they did, Synthesis grew out of Ad Astra, which is the school that was founded by Josh Dan, our founder in Synthesis, and Elon Musk 7 years ago at the SpaceX campus. So they created this school because Elon felt like we were not really preparing kids for the kinds of jobs that they were going to have in the future. We weren't teaching them how to think and how to solve real problems. And that was a big priority for him. So they created this lab school that would teach kids the things that really mattered, but in a fun way that wouldn't feel like school. So the most popular class of the school was called Synthesis. And it was, you would teach kids how to solve problems, like really complex problems that, are applicable to the real world through games and simulations, right? That resembled the real world. So instead of like giving kids instructions, which is what happens in school, and sort of like walking them through, like kids were just sort of like thrown in a complex problem, and it was like, figure it out. You have your team members and you can fail as many times, but you need to figure it out. And this was very motivating for the kids. They were really into it, and you were able to pull from different areas and fields of study and teach them within this problem-focused approach. So the kids were obsessed with it. Like they could stay, sometimes they would skip recess to work on these problems because they were so into them. And we would teach them through this, they would teach them mental models, and they would develop this toolkit so that they knew when they encountered a situation in the real world, they could pull from these things that they had learned and apply them to the real world. So once Elon's kids graduated and the school moved out of SpaceX, it became Astronova. And then the founders of Synthesis, back then came and they said, well, why don't we grab this class and we try to scale it, and we put it in the online environment and we offer it to kids all over the world. And so that's what they did. They started sort of like coding and putting into, this software developing programs, like the different games. And that's when they contacted me. I decided to join them, and we've been sort of like pulling different kids and having them experience this new way of learning. So it's like a game-based approach to teach kids what they're not learning in school. And we're just getting started. So the company's not even 6 months old, but we have so many ideas that we want to do, and we're willing to, just sort of like peek and change things as we go. And every game that we design is based on the current problems and challenges that students are taking upon. So we involve them in the experience, and sometimes they even become like the designers of the experience. So they're really involved in the process, and it's mixed age groups. So you have kids 8 through 14 in different cohorts, and they're learning through these simulations and games, but they're not just games, right? Like there's a lot of nutritional value in them. But for them, it's just very active. And although it's online, you see the kids like at the edge of their seats, and they just can't wait. And everything's so fast paced, and there's an element of surprise and uncertainty because we want to make it like the real world. In school, things are very straightforward, and we water things down so that it's easier to grade. Here, it's the opposite. We make things complex because we know that kids not only can handle complexity, but they actually crave it. And we make things uncertain because our world is pretty chaotic and pretty uncertain. So we want to throw kids in these kinds of situations, but in a safe environment, so that they start to learn how to navigate things that they're going to actually encounter in the real world. It helps them think differently. It sort of empowers them to make decisions that they don't do in school. So they're having to, in the moment make, decisions that have consequence and high stake consequences for them in the games, and then reflect on those consequences and see how they would do it differently next time. So we're really treating them like adults, but in a safe environment. And the teachers are there, like they barely talk, they're facilitators, and they're there again to make sure that the kids are asking the right questions and taking those questions to the right answers and so forth and so on. But usually when kids ask, well, how do I do this? The answer is, figure it out. Like, I don't know, So it's just been super interesting having kids from traditional backgrounds joining this experience. And at the beginning being like, what is this? Extremely frustrating because it's very chaotic. Like the session is very chaotic, but then they start to embrace that and they're like, this is so fun. Like I can see the value in this. So we're very excited. We plan to continue creating games and just sort of like keep adding things to our curriculum, even though we don't call it a curriculum, to make sure that we're doing things that are relevant to the kids and relevant to what the kids need nowadays.
You're doing something innovative when there's no word for it yet.
Exactly. That's how we feel.
So I recently read a profile on Ninja, who's like the Fortnite player. And he said, parents, if you want to really understand what type of person your kid is, just watch them play a video game, because the questions they ask, how they deal with emotions when they're frustrated, how they soothe themselves, all that stuff. Are they yelling? Are they calm? Like, I think it tells you a lot. And you actually recently wrote about the role of games in learning. And you said in school, we learn to play the status game, the grades game, the compliance game. But there's another game we're not taught, which is this meta game. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So when we design all these games, we are often thinking, what's our purpose with this? Like, what do we want kids to accomplish or to learn through this game? And we don't want for them to get really good at Constellation, which is one of our first games, or Art for All, which is another of our game. Like, that's not our purpose. Our purpose is for them to, there's a lot of value in these games and things that you can extract to the real world. So what we want is for them to play enough of these games that have layers and layers of complexity and that are working on the same skills, but from different contexts, so that they're able to learn the meta game, which is sort of like that set of skills and tools to master any game. And we use the word games, but it's not just for games, right? Like really successful people in the real world, that's sort of like the approach that they have, right? So they think, okay, what's the game that everyone's playing? That's not the game I'm going to play. Let me try to see how I can use what I'm really good at and figure out a different way to do something. And that's how they become really successful, because they're playing a different game. So that's sort of like what we want to teach them, because they already know how to play the game from school. Like most of them do come from traditional schooling. So here we're like, okay, forget about that. We're going to teach you, like, you're going to play multiple games over a number of years, because the idea is for them, it's a subscription model. So they stay with us for several years so that they learn how to think differently. They learn how to pick up on the things that they're learning at these games and how to translate it to the real world so they can use it when they face this difficult situation. So we're teaching them sort of like patterns for them to recognize like patterns in difficult situations. That's really like ultimately what we're teaching them when we talk about the metagame.
That's so interesting. It's now a game, but in the future it might evolve to be a school, right? Mm-hmm. That's something you're thinking about?
Right. So the way it's interesting, because we get this question a lot, like parents automatically say, we love synthesis, but when is this going to be a full-time thing? I want to pull my kid out, and we don't want to be associated with the word school.
Okay.
Really challenging, because then what do we call this, right?
Yeah.
But because we're doing things so differently, like right now it's an enrichment program. So it's something that you're like adding to your education journey, whatever it is that you're doing. It's like a component of your education. But in the future, we're hoping to add enough simulations, and we're really building a community of kids who want to make a ding in the universe. That's like how we say it. So we're adding different components, not just the simulations, as we grow, to make this sort of like the place that you go to learn, things that are going to be really valuable in the real world. And we don't really know what that's going to look like yet, if it's going to be like a full-time thing, or if it's always going to be a complement. So because it's so different and there's nothing out there like that, we're still shaping what this is going to become.
So with COVID, obviously the effects have been far-reaching. Education has, been one of those things that has been changing. What have you seen in terms of alternative schools that are popping up?
Yeah, so it's interesting, because when it comes to the alternative education space, there's like a lot that has to happen, and a lot of different companies and services that need to be provided for it to work, because parents, again, need the thing about traditional schooling is that really it's a daycare in the end of the day, right? Like the parents drop the kids off and pick them up after 8 hours because they have to work. So for something like synthesis to work, it has to be paired up with other things that are popping up in the alternative education space. And we all sort of understand that. So we're trying to elevate the category, and it's not a competition, but rather we all need to work together to sort of create this space and make it doable for parents. So I've seen interesting things, like, for example, there's, they haven't launched yet, but I think it's called Moonbug, and let me just double check the name. But it's a space that they're creating, and the idea is to open up in different states. It's beautiful, and it's like an open space for kids different ages. You have facilitators, and you have different resources. You have sort of like a little library. Then you have the more technological side of the room, but you drop kids off there, and they can either work on their online classes, or they can stay there for as many hours as you want, but it's a creative space. And the facilitators are trained to sort of help you work on little projects, and you're with other kids. So there's that social component. So the idea is that parents who send their kids to an online school, for example, or to a forest school, which are these outdoor spaces for a few hours, and then they have that online component. Where do you take your kids? You drop them off at a place like this. I think it's called Moonbug, but I need to double check. So that's for example, this kind of spaces. Then you have something like Premier. I don't know if you've heard, for homeschooling. So it's sort of like a homeschooling platform. And it enables parents who want to do homeschooling, but they don't really know what resources to pull from, or where's the community for that social component. So they're sort of making homeschooling easy. So that's also something that I've seen that's very interesting. Then you have different schools like, Prisma is an online school as well that I've seen that's very interesting. Then you have, what's this one? OutSchool, which is sort of like a marketplace of different classes. And that one's a bit more traditional, I would say, but it's still like an alternative out there. But the way that I sort of like see it playing in the future, once there are enough of these different alternative solutions, is that education is going to be sort of like a pick and choose, like a marketplace online where parents go and they say, well, this is my situation. I need to, this amount of hours for this, or I need to drop my kid off, or I need my kid to learn this. And so you get to pick, okay, it's going to be an online learning. These are my options. Then I'm going to drop them off in soccer. Here are my options. Then they're going to go to a micro school 2 hours a week. Here are my options. So hopefully the way I envision is you're going to be able to sort of like form your own education. And it's going to be very flexible and different from what it is now, right? And there's going to be a lot of downtime for kids to sort of explore and engage in self-directed learning in the afternoons. So that's the way that I see it playing in the future, but we're still like a long way from that. So we're all working together to make this happen.
As you're talking, one of the biggest downsides or challenges that I see is like the socioeconomic aspect of this. Mm-hmm. How can we make these alternative options and all these like amazing school options affordable to everybody? Because otherwise you kind of risk perpetuating this like gap of you're going to go this direction and people who have money are going to send their kids to these amazing schools and everybody else just gets stuck in the traditional.
Yeah. So this is something that I had in mind when I decided to leave the system. And this is exactly why I went into online education. So actually this was before COVID that I decided to explore the online education space, because I was thinking, when I started doing my research, there are many alternative schools out there, and there's some that are so amazing, so incredible, but they are limited to people who can afford them. So not a lot of kids can go to these schools, or they're limited to people in the location. So yes, they are incredible, and I'm sure that they're making a difference, but that's not the reality for all kids. So I was trying to think, well, what's something that eventually can be more accessible to other kids? And people often criticize like, oh, but you're all in favor for online learning, which is, one of the things I'm in favor for. It's not all about online learning, but I've seen an opportunity here. But and they say, well, kids need to have a computer. Like, what about kids in rural areas around the world where they don't? And I'm like, yeah, but they also don't have access to these amazing schools that are being created in different places. So I think that, with time, internet will reach this rural areas. Like, we're heading there. Like, I've seen it in different countries. So to me, that's more of a possibility. So if we're sort of that's sort of inspirational to me. Like, if I'm able to help create something online that a kid that eventually will get a laptop, maybe a communal one, but in a rural area in India, in a village, and they have access to internet, because eventually they will, like a lot of places will, and they can have access to something like this, then that's amazing. Like, that's doable, right? So that's sort of like what inspires me. I obviously don't have an answer to this, to sort of like how would this change, but right now it feels like it's having more impact than what I was doing before, and what people are trying to do with these specific schools in countries.
Last year, I read this profile on a Harvard professor named David Malin, and he teaches computer science. It's called CS50. And that intro course became so popular because he embraced distant learning when a lot of his peer professors did not. And he is able to reach through his class. It's like really well done. There's production quality. He's able to reach 2 million people across the world. Like, it's absolutely incredible that all these, and there, he sells merch. Like, there's like CS50 t-shirts. To me, it's like, I really believe that the best teachers out there should be famous. They should make millions of dollars. They should be compensated well, and they should be able to reach so many humans around the world. Do you see a world via online learning, like you said, where there is an option for people from Panama to Bulgaria to access the best teachers in the world, and it's not like anybody can afford it? Is that a reality?
I absolutely think that. I actually experienced that myself. I had never taken an online course. When I left teaching, I enrolled in this course called it's a cohort-based online course called Rite of Passage by David Perel. And that was the first time that I experienced like live online learning from someone who I really admired as a writer, who's David. And then with a group of people, I didn't know that an online course could be so transformational and so live. It was very social. I was very involved. I was very motivated, and it did not feel like I was online. So that's sort of when it sparked the idea. I was like, oh my gosh, this is doable. I'm learning from the best writer, like one of the best writers out there. And I'm learning with an incredible group of people who are pushing me to become better. And the outcomes were incredible. That's when I started writing and creating content online after taking that course. So after seeing that, I definitely believe that that's sort of like where we are heading. And I think that the best teachers that I've seen out there and online and in everything are the ones who either haven't been teachers before, so they don't have all these preconceived notions and things that they are like, oh, I need to do things this way or not, or the ones like, and that's sort of like David Perel and Tiago Forte, like these are two phenomenal online teachers that have had so much success and that their students like rave about their courses and they've been so transformational. None of them were teachers before, so they had nothing to sort of like compare it to. They created this from scratch based on what they felt like would work and for an online audience and the needs of the students, etc. So to me, those are the most effective teachers. And then the ones who do have a background in teaching, like for example, me or Josh Dan, the founder of Synthesis, who was a teacher before he was hired by Elon. What we do is instead of trying to find solutions to the system and doing things for the system and pressing changes to the system, we're sort of like building things outside and rethinking from first principles. So like, okay, forget about like the way things have done and the curriculums and how we should do things. Let's go back to basics. What do we know about kids, how they learn, and the things that they're going to need nowadays, and then build from there without sort of like looking outside. And those are the most effective teachers, the most effective educators, and the ones that I think are going to be making millions and impacting so many kids out there, because we're focusing on the things that really matter, right? Without looking at this outdated system that, it's producing kids, like we said, for things that don't really matter anymore.
Absolutely. So this is my last question. I want to leave on this note because I just published a dossier on Stephen Hawking, who I think is just a beautiful example of like what you can do with a love for learning. Your entire body may be disabled physically, but your mind can be at its peak. And he said, the greatest enemy to knowledge is not ignorance. It is the illusion of knowledge. As an educator, have you found that to be true?
Absolutely. So the way I think about it is, in order to be an effective educator, I've had to unlearn a lot of the things that I learned in school. And even in ed school, which is supposed to be a great school and a great program, they still teach you things that, to me, they're very limiting. So for you to be able to be an effective educator, an effective learner, you need to be able to let go of the things that, and it goes back to, again, questioning things and holding this attitude of skepticism and surrounding yourself with people who are, open-minded and think differently. But being able to say, well, wait a minute, why do I believe this? Does this make sense? Or is this something that I can let go? And should I replace it with a new thought or a new way of doing things? So being open to saying, I learned something that is no longer valuable or it was never valuable. Let me let that go, which is not easy, but at least acknowledging it. And okay, so what do I know that is true? And let me replace it with a new habit. So that I've had to do a lot of that, in terms of the role of the teacher, the way that we should be teaching and engaging kids. Like that has been a huge one. Like these are all things that I've had to unlearn in order to do things right.
Yeah, that's amazing. Actually, one more question. What does the word success mean to you?
So success, and I think a lot about this in terms of schooling, is any education that's successful is one that helps you understand what you're good at, what's meaningful to you, and what you're capable of doing, on your own with the resources that you have around you. But like that to me is success. Like if you go through any learning program, it doesn't really matter what it is, and you're able to figure that out, what you're good at, what you're passionate about, what you're willing to do for the rest of your life, then that's success. And that can be many different things, but if you have that, you're going to be very good at whatever it is that you do.
I love that. I define it the same way. Thank you so much, Ana. This was great.
No, thank you, Paulina. This has been awesome.